Don't know if you can hear my birds. Okay, so this is what I'm going to draw. I actually Googled alien from The Simpsons because originally I wanted to draw an alien from The Simpsons. But when I Googled that, it came up with this toy of Maggie as an alien. And I thought that was so cute. Okay, so I'm just going to start with the basic shapes. Then her body's like a triangle. So she kind of has this kind of like rounded square head with these stars coming out of the top. Ooh. Then one in the corner there, and then one here. She has a little ear right here. I'll put it here as well. And she has a little triangle there. Wait. A little one, and a little one there. Right triangle there. Okay, and then she has these tentacles coming out here. And she has like a baby's bottle here. And another tentacle here. And then she has more coming up here behind the bottle. And then she has this little, she's holding this little teddy bear. And then there's a cube. I love drawing shapes like cubes because they're so easy. She's got this shaker that babies have. I'm gonna use my Blackwing Palomino. I love these pencils. They're so awesome. And then there are like ripples here on her clothes. She has these really big eyes. Big black eyes. Let me draw the bow first. She's got a bow. Kind of squarish actually. Okay. Then she's got a little dummy here. She's got a little nose. And she's got a big eyes. Okay. So now I'm going to try to draw the tentacles. And then we have the little bear. Okay, I'm going to try to rub all of this off. Where are my big rubbers? And then what I try to do is rub it off, and hopefully I press hard enough that there'll be an imprint on the paper. And then I go over it with watercolor. Okay, things are a bit messy, but I'm just gonna go ahead and start painting. Okay, let's try yellow first. I'm gonna try mixing it here. I think there's a tinge of orange to the one on the doll. On the screen, it appears to look a little bit darker than it is in real life. So they are fairly easy to use. They disperse quite well. They go on down on the paper very nicely. I think, I feel like they mixed really well when I mixed the yellow with the orange to get this kind of more darker yellow. And they produce nice washes. So far, it's not muddy or chalky. I did have that experience earlier, but that's because I mixed two colors 4 times. And yeah, obviously you don't want to mix them a lot, but even here you can see it's dried now, the one that got really chalky, and it doesn't look so bad actually. It looks quite nice. I managed to get a nice gradient. As you can see, it goes from being quite saturated to a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter. Though here the magenta and the blue seem to have separated. I think I need to mix the yellow and the orange a bit more. I think that may be a little too orange, so I'm going to try a little bit more yellow. The thing about watercolors as well is that if you add water to it, it will create lighter hues. So you can have one color, but by adding more water, it becomes lighter. That's one thing I like about watercolors. Also, watercolors is a fairly easy medium to use. I think it's a great beginner's medium. It is also about the ratio of how much water you add. That's something I still struggle with. But you'll know once it's on the paper, and you'll get used to it and you'll figure it out. But I mean, it's easy in the sense that it's immediate, like all you need is water. You don't need anything else. Like oil, there's a bunch of things you need before you can even start oil painting. It's not the same as watercolor. You just need a cup of water like the one I'm using. I've actually got two. I'm not doing this the way I'm supposed to be doing, because you're supposed to dip it in one and then dip it in the other, just to make sure you cleaned out your brush properly. But yeah, okay, well, that's the yellow. I'll add the shadows later once it's dried. Trying to get rid of the yellow so I can work on the blue now, because her clothes are blue. I'll try adding the blue now. I realized that I've made her hair too big, but I can't change it now. Let me try and get that blue. Okay, so look at my color chart. I would say it's probably this one, maybe with a little bit of that one. Oh, so okay, that one is the one next to the pink. The thing about mixing colors is it's also a lot about experimentation. Okay, so now I'm gonna try this one. Though in watercolors, you can use the white, but you're not supposed to use the white. You're supposed to use water to lighten the color, which is what I was saying earlier. Though it's also hard to tell at this point how it's going to dry. The bottle was like the same color as her little robe and her bow. I think white is good for when you're a beginner at watercolor like I am. Because yeah, with watercolor, you're definitely not supposed to use white. Maybe I should have tested the color before using it. That was a bit silly of me. I think next time what I'm going to do is just test the color on this other piece of paper, just see what it looks like when it goes down on the paper, and then either use it or keep mixing it accordingly. Okay, there's also some blue here on the rattle. And the thing about the watercolors as well is that you can lift the color. So I don't need to add any more color if I'm trying to fill in the robe. I can just use the color that's already there and just lift it and bring it to the corners and the sides. You can also run the danger of becoming a little watery. So yeah, they mix quite well. When I mixed the blue, I also encountered no problems, really nothing to speak of that stands out for me. I thought the blue was fine. I mixed two blues to get this blue and a little bit of white. And even though it does feel a bit chalky on the palette, when I add water to it, it kind of removes some of that chalkiness away. So it's not so bad, actually. I think what I'm going to do at the end, when I finish the picture, just go over it with pencil to get some details in. So what I'm going to do, guys, is because I'm working with watercolors, this is one thing about watercolors, is sometimes you're going to have to let them dry. These appear to be drying quite quick, to be fair. However, that may be to do with the paper. Paper makes a massive difference when it comes to any art medium. It doesn't matter if it's pencil, watercolors, wash, etc. Maybe not oil, because oil is so thick. You can pretty much use oil on anything and you'll get pretty much the same effect every time, unless you're using like canvas. There's always going to be some texture that pops through, but then it depends on whether you dilute the oil or whether you use it really, really thick. This is the good thing about watercolors. That's why it's so good for beginners, because if you make a mistake, you can lift it off and adjust it as you go along. With watercolor, you can lift the color, so it's lifted quite well. On a first impression, I would say so far these watercolors are quite good. They mix really well, or at least that's been my experience so far. Literally tried them today for the first time, so this is my experience for the last like hour and a half. See, it feels dry. I think it's because of the paper. It absorbs the water quite quickly. I think the colors are quite vibrant, quite pretty. You can see that the particles have separated from the water in some cases, but that's just something that happens quite a bit with cheap watercolors, I find. So far, I've been pretty impressed with these watercolors, to be fair. They are a cheap children's set, I believe. One thing I wanted to touch on was the fact that at the back it mentions that these colors are light fast. Here we go. Vivid colors, good covering power, light fast. Okay, well, they might be. Unless I did an experiment myself, I wouldn't be able to tell you guys. But usually cheap watercolor sets or any cheap art supplies don't tend to be light fast. But it depends on what kind of pigment they use for the colors. I mean, they might be. Sometimes companies put that information on their art supplies and they don't really understand what that means. It's really weird. For those of you who aren't aware, light fast just means that a color is resistant to light, but it also means it's resistant to other weather factors like humidity, dust, etc. That's why in museums, not with all the paintings perhaps, but with a lot of paintings, because paintings get restored. So if they lose their color and they start turning sepia, museums have restorers on hand to kind of bring the original hues back to the painting. The quality of the pigment or hue is not that great. You can get some really nice secondary colors from the mixing of the colors, and they're not muddy, which is good, because that's one of the worst things that you can get with a cheap art medium is when the colors become muddy when you mix them. So it's good that that's not happening here. That's a good sign. Even if the pigment looks a little bit cheap, which makes sense. Again, the particles are separating from the water, but we'll live with that. I'm just going to paint the eyes because they're just supposed to be straight black. So I'm just going to use the black and see what happens, but I don't think this black is dark enough. Oh, it's not so bad, actually. What happens is when you add white, instead of lightening the color, sometimes what it does is just turn it into a pastel version of that color. So you add yellow instead, because that, not too much yellow, but a little bit yellow, because that will lighten the color and keep the vibrancy rather than dilute it into a pastel. It does feel quite opaque. I mean, this has dried quite matte, so it's possible that this is kind of a gouache type of paint rather than watercolor, and I was just diluting it using a lot of water, because this certainly looks more matte than the rest of this. And this, as I said, this was created using a lot of water. But that looks pretty matte, the eyes and the dummy now, because I used less water. So it's possible that this is more of a gouache than a watercolor. And I was just diluting the color a lot. It does say on here that it is an opaque paint box. That's what we call gouache opaque watercolors. So it's possible that this is some sort of gouache. Also, sometimes they dry lighter than they look when you first put them on the paper. But with gouache, you get this lovely matte finish that I really like. Yeah, this may be gouache rather than watercolor because it does, now that I've played with it a little bit more, it does feel quite opaque, quite matte, and gouache dries matte, as opposed to watercolor, which dries translucently. I think you can see the chalk a little bit more in the painting now. When you dilute it with water, when you dilute this paint with water, it's not so obvious. But when you use it like a gouache, it becomes a little bit chalky. I wonder why this black is turning. Every time I add it to some sort of yellow, it becomes very greenish. Okay, I think I'm going to be using these Reeves colored pencils. So I don't want the lines to be too obvious because I don't want it to look too cartoonish, even though it is a cartoon. So I just want some soft lines in there. One of the things I will say about these paints is that they don't dry consistently depending on how much paint you use. So I wouldn't recommend these to professionals because I don't think the finishing look, if that makes sense, it doesn't look professional. It looks like children's watercolors. Like with any gouache paints, they are pretty thick, but when you add water to them, if you add a substantial amount, they start behaving like watercolors and become translucent, like so. So gouache, I believe it used to be poster paint. So before the days of Photoshop, gouache was used to, well, Photoshop pictures, but without the Photoshop. So if artists were asked to remove blemishes or do what you would do these days in Photoshop, basically they would use the gouache to make those corrections, essentially. And that's what gouache was used for. It was more of a designer's tool. It wasn't really used in art. You know, I don't think it's seen as a fine art medium. Maybe it is now, but even now I think it's not quite there. Maybe it's moving that way, but I don't think it's quite there yet. Yeah, so when you see picture, one thing that I find really funny is when people are discussing photos of old celebrities versus new celebrities, or rather modern or current celebrities, and they look at those old black and white photos and they're like, oh, look how smooth their skin was and look how pretty they were, and you know, and this was before Photoshop. And actually they're wrong, because those photos were photoshopped. They just weren't photoshopped the way they think, because obviously they didn't use computers back then. They used paint, like wash paint, poster paint, but the pictures were photoshopped. So that smooth skin, that would have been, you know, no one has skin that's smooth. That would have been painted over. The blemishes would have been corrected. All sorts of things would have been corrected in those pictures. So when you're looking at a black and white picture of an actress that you love or an actor that you love, don't be fooled and think, oh my God, they were perfect. No, trust me, they painted over those pictures. And not to mention that even back then, there was already surgery, maybe not the way it is today, and definitely more hush-hush. They're much more open about that now. But yeah, those things already existed to a certain extent. This is the most telling sign that it is gouache, because you can actually layer the white on top. If it was watercolor, it would be too translucent. Lifting the paint from these cakes is actually quite difficult because there's so much chalk that I have to add a substantial amount of water before the color will even lift and come off on my paintbrush. I feel like I have to dig with a paintbrush in order to get the color to lift, which is not very nice, to be fair. I don't think children will mind as a starter set, and even students if they can't afford anything better. They don't really specify in the box what it is. They just say it's an opaque paint box, which again, I know, opaque watercolors is just another term for gouache, and it feels like gouache, but yeah, they don't officially say it on the box. It's always good to have a tissue at hand when painting with water-based paints. This is the importance of having a good drawing to begin with, so you don't have to go and clean up afterwards like this, which takes even more time than the actual drawing itself. The good thing about gouache is that because it's opaque, you can cover a lot of mistakes with that. Some people say it's a bit like in between watercolors and acrylic, and I guess I see what they're saying. I think opaque watercolors is it's a more appropriate term, but I see what they're saying because it's opaque like acrylic, except it's more matte, I think. And it allows you can layer it really well because of its opacity, and you can cover mistakes really easily because of its opacity, and you can do that with acrylic too. But also, like watercolors, you can lift it, you can make it translucent if you add enough water. So I just think gouache is a really versatile medium, personally. I love how matte it is. I think the matte finish is one of the most beautiful things about it. These are not the prettiest gouache paints I've worked with, but when you work with really professional ones, the quality you get is just amazing. But I really liked, for example, that I was able to draw on top of them once they're dry. I think that's really cool. They do dry quite fast, like acrylic does. I think that's another reason why they say gouache is like a mixture of acrylic and watercolor, because acrylic dries really fast. And gouache in general dries really fast as well. But unlike acrylic, you can lift the color after it's dried. Can't do that with acrylic. Just keep that in mind, because when I tried acrylic for the first time, I literally went into it completely unprepared. I did not do any research on it. I had no idea what to expect. I thought it was just a paint like all the others. I didn't realize how fast it was going to dry. And so I put a lot of paint on my palette and I put a lot of paint on my paper. Then when I tried lifting it, it wouldn't lift. And I was like, oh, no. And then I thought I'd done something wrong. So I did some research, and that's when I found out that acrylic, once it's dry, that is it. But the thing is, you can layer over it, so that's okay. With paint, really, it's all about how it dries. It doesn't matter what it looks like when it's wet, because you want to look out for the finish that you get, for the effect that you get once it dries, because these are cheap. They don't dry very saturated, which is a little bit frustrating, to be fair. It could be that this gouache or these gouache paints just don't work very well with this paper. That could be why the finish looks a bit dry. It could just be the paper itself. They do layer super well though. I do like that about these paints, and they do mix really well. Also, I believe the thing about gouache is that it also dries lighter than when it first goes on the paper. After a while, if you mix the paints enough times, they become a little bit streaky, which is not very nice, unfortunately. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I suppose I should give you some final thoughts on these paints because it is a review. So as already stated, I think these lean more towards the gouache side of things than watercolor. I don't think, as I've already said before, that they are proper gouache. I think it's more that they have a lot of chalk in them, and so because of this, they operate more like gouache than watercolor. But regardless, the box is right. They are opaque paints. I think that they mix quite well and they layer quite well, but the finish, they dry a little bit chalky, and it just doesn't look great. I would say they're good for students or children, but I wouldn't recommend them to professionals because of the way that they dry. I think they can be good if you're still learning, or if you're a professional, but you've never tried gouache and you want to try gouache to see what it's like, but you don't want to spend a lot of money, then this may be a good first set for you to try. They mix well, they layer well, the colors are quite vibrant and pretty. But but they are quite chalky. That's the only thing. The important thing is how the paints dry. You want them to look good after they're dried, and I mean they look okay. It's okay. It looks good. I like the final painting, but I did find it hard. I mean, I say they mix well, as in they blend well, but actually. It really depends how much color you're using. If it's diluted with water, they tend to mix okay. But if you use a lot like I did here, I did struggle to blend them a little bit. So overall, I mean, I personally don't think I'm going to use them again. I did enjoy painting this. I thought it was a lot of fun. I wasn't crazy about how the paints felt on the paper. And I have so many brands that this is definitely not one of my favorites. Again, I'm not saying they're bad because they're not. I've tried all sorts of cheap art supplies, and some cheap art supplies are really, truly terrible. You can't use them at all. They're so bad. Sometimes they don't have enough pigment, or they don't blend well, or they don't mix well. I wouldn't recommend them at all. With these ones, I do recommend them if you're a beginner, or if you're, a child, or if you're a student, or if you're new to gouache. I think these are good enough for, experimenting or starting with, a first set. They're fine. But yeah, I don't like the chalk finish, so I couldn't recommend them to professionals. If I was giving it a rating, I would say 6 out of 10. This is a good thing about these water-based paints, is you can go over it with pencil quite easily. The chalk of the paint has made it look a little bit pastel, maybe because I mixed them too much. That was one of the problems with these paints, that after a while the colors become a little bit muddy if you mix them too much, but also quite chalky, and you can see the chalk. I hope you guys have enjoyed my review and the final painting. Please let me know in the comments what you think. And if you like my artwork, please do subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Once again, I appreciate all the support you guys have given me. And let me know if you have anything in mind, like a brand you want me to review, or a painting you want me, a picture you want me to create. Anything, let me know. And once again, thank you so much, guys. I hope you like the final product, and thank you for sticking with me, supporting me, and watching my videos. You guys are the best. Love you. Thank you. And have a lovely evening or day wherever you are on the planet.